we're oftentimes looking to the very last events that took place, the very last conversations or moments of their lives to understand if I had just done this one thing different, if they would still be here. But that it's really to shortchange their experience that there were many, many things that led up to that point.
Hi, my name is Lance, and this is UNSILENT, a speak series by No Stigmas that champions mental health advocacy and challenges stigmas that all too often prevent people from getting the help they need. We're so happy you're here. In today's first part of a three-part conversation, we get to know Danielle, who personally is a triple suicide loss survivor and professionally is a cultural rhetorician and a professor of English and composition. So she really understands the importance and the power of storytelling and sharing lived experiences with one another. In today's episode, we get to know more about Danielle and her history with mental health, as well as the experiences surrounding her loss. She also dives into the idea of survivor's guilt and this pressure we put on ourselves to say the right thing or what could we have done. And she reminds us of the... We're so thankful to Danielle for sharing her story with us and being so honest and open and vulnerable. Thank you again for being with us, and remember, to break these stigmas, we must be unsilent. Let's dive in. Today's episode contains in-depth conversations around suicide, suicidal ideation, and suicide loss. It's okay if you need to skip this one. Do what's right for you.
I consider myself a mental health advocate because I am a survivor of two suicides in my immediate family. My father and my brother both completed suicide. My mother also, she's passed now, but she struggled greatly with PTSD, with depression, with her own struggles with mental illness. And I have also had my own journey with them as well. And because of those lived experiences and also seeing my students struggle, I'm a professor, and with the experiences of the collective trauma and grief of COVID with the pandemic, I have seen a great need for us to continue to try to destigmatize mental illness and to try to gain greater conversation and advocacy about issues of mental health, issues of mental illness, what it means to have ongoing journeys of depression, anxiety, living with PTSD, living as a survivor of suicides when someone you know completes suicide in that way. So that's a little bit about my background and why I think it is so important and so personal to me as well. I grew up in a family that was quite dysfunctional. My father was an alcoholic, and looking back, I think both of my parents had issues with PTSD and their own journeys of mental illness that went undiagnosed. And because of that, I grew up in a very dysfunctional and volatile relationship, a volatile atmosphere. My background was very dysfunctional, and because of that, I see that had really shaped my own experiences with learning how to exist in a dysfunctional background and a traumatic time in space, and what that's meant for me now. So that was a little bit about how I grew up, and it's certainly with the experiences of my brother and my father completing suicide. I needed to address some of the issues that were a part of my dysfunctional past that led them to that point, but also things that were part of my lived embodied experiences that were part of how I needed to cope with my own mental health and my own mental journey towards mental wellness. So I don't believe that something like suicide or something like a dysfunctional family happens all at once, as part of a continuous journey. And I see that now. And so I think you're smart to kind of highlight how people, their backgrounds, how they grow up and how that plays a part in our mental health and our perhaps likelihood of having to address mental illness in ourselves and in our family members. It became a moment for me where I needed to take a really hard look at myself and the way that I was handling my mental health and addressing some of the mental illnesses that I carried, as I said, like the depression and the PTSD and the anxiety from some of the ways that I'd grown up, my coping mechanisms, some of the genetic components that I had handed down for me, and just what I had to kind of endure with their dysfunction and their untreated mental illness for several years. But I got to a point where I needed to realize that they are all past now, and that the accountability was really on me. And that was a hard thing, and that is a hard thing. It's part of my journey and understanding that it's important for me to validate that I was a victim, to acknowledge that that was a hard thing, to acknowledge that I was a survivor, that I moved past that, but that I didn't necessarily, as you I think you're alluding to, I didn't want to be entirely defined, my story, by their experience, their choices, and it therefore I needed to undergo some intense self-reflection, therapy, and healing, because otherwise cycles of trauma can just continue. I can pinpoint various moments in my parents' lives where they were also victims and survivors, but that ultimately we need, though we haven't, though we're not in charge of our trauma, we're still in charge of healing from it and take accountability of that, because I am almost 40 years old, and I am an adult now, and my family members have passed. So I need to make sure that I'm in charge of my own accountability and self autonomy and healing, so that I don't continue to perpetuate intergenerational trauma and harm. So that's grappling with those interconnectedness, that interrelationship, interrelatedness between my family members' influence on me, but also now, especially realizing I am the author of my story, and what I choose to do now, how I choose to live, and how I choose to cope with these things is truly my decision, and it's on me now. So trying to weigh both of those things, like I influence them in ways that I would not have chosen. I would not have authored this story in this way. But I see it. I choose my words very, very carefully here. I see it as a potential blessing that I may choose to address cycles of dysfunction and intergenerational harm, intergenerational trauma, from their choices and the fact that they've passed now. And if it hadn't been so bad, so many tragedies, so many moments of grief and multiple suicides, I'm not sure I would have had to take a good hard look at the choices that they made, and maybe some of the choices that I was making, to make some really, really concrete decisions about the ways in which I was going to live my life differently, and seeking out healing in multiple forms of therapy and support and lifestyle choices and changes, because it it was the moment where I could no longer blame somebody else, and I couldn't hide from myself. That was scary and freeing at the same time. Both of those things are true, but it has pushed me to try to heal and cope and find healthier ways of living that I don't think I would have done otherwise. Maybe I ought to have taken the very, very depressive comments or desire to die more seriously. I think that that's part of the coping and the grieving. Ultimately, though, you have to move past that point and realize that it's not going to serve you. It's not going to change the outcome. You can make yourself very, very unwell, and be very, very unkind to yourself by having that continuous conversation in your head again and again and again. I have spent time in survivors support groups where they talk about the cup that overflowed, and that's a very helpful metaphor. In which case, we as people who aren't in a suicidal mindset strive to understand how somebody could have done that and reached that point. And we're oftentimes looking to the very last events that took place, the very last conversations or moments of their lives, to understand, if I had just done this one thing different, if they would still be here. But that it's really to shortchange their experience, that there were many, many things that led up to that point. We one drop, the one thing that caused the cup to overflow, but that there was the problem was it had been building for them. It had been building for them. So I think validating your grief and your coping, and the flux of emotions that you're going to feel is important. I mean, that's true for anybody who's mourning and grieving any loss or any death. How much more for suicide, which we have a really hard time grappling with. It's very hard for the suicide survivors, and that can be a family member, that can be a partner, a colleague, a friend, and just anyone within the community. The very idea of suicide really shakes people because we have a very hard time understanding how somebody could be in that much pain and that sort of a mental place to end it all, especially not knowing what comes next, right? We have faith, we have convictions, we have beliefs and hopes, but how could it be that bad that the unknown is preferable? And I think that it's also important to realize that whatever you're feeling, all of those emotions of anger, of sadness, of guilt, to validate them, not to try to repress them, but then as they are emotions, to understand that they are fleeting and that this is part of a very, very complex process of grief. I think it is extremely painful no matter what the emotion, and our tendency to try to grapple with that pain is to ignore it, repress it, self medicate, all of the things that we but that the best and most healthiest thing is to find outlets for it and to allow them to flow and allow yourself to feel those things. That is how I have coped and how I have learned from other people's stories and experiences of coping. Grief is intense. It comes in waves. It'll let you know when it's done with you, but it's also I hesitate even to use that language because I think there's no true healing. There's no true when you get over something like this. It's all new norm. It's all part of how you live with it. This is part of your story and your experience. You are changed forevermore, and it becomes better and more constructive. I think to help to help you to think of it as this new stage, this new position in life after this experience. How am I going to carry it and cope with it? Because there's just no going back. It's forever different. And accepting that rather than trying to change that, and that can be very hard. We don't necessarily do a really great job, I don't think, in this culture talking about and dealing with death and grief. As I said, that's even with um, you know deaths of people who are no less painful, but terminally ill, expected. Again, when someone takes their own life, it's a specific category of how in the world could that happen and how can we process. But we don't do a very good job of holding space for that and having a really good language in which to offer support. We use oftentimes trite platitudes and things, and I think people don't know what to say, and they try, but people can be very, very uncomfortable, and also addressing that people care, but people don't necessarily know what to say. And so also kind of being aware of that and having your own ways of addressing that and talking about it with yourself once the inevitable, you know, thing is said that can be harmful and hurtful. Find your people that will hold space for you, allow you to process and share your story without the need to impart some sort of wisdom or religious commentary on where they are now. They're in a better place. Everything happens for a reason. God never gives you more than you can handle. All of those things are very, very um, harmful and hurtful for people who have experienced any loss and any death, but especially so with self, completion of suicide, I think. I think I would encourage us to take a step back and interrogate the whole concept of what do I say? Why do we have to say anything? Why do we think that our words will be especially useful or fix the situation? Because it's not going to. It's not going to take away the hurt. It's not going to bring the person back. I think more often when people are grieving, whether it's from suicide loss or a death of a family member or friend in another way, we're looking for someone to hold space for us. We're looking for somebody to listen to us and be present with us in our pain and the experience that we're enduring. To be able to offer that with extreme compassion, empathy, openness to listen and to try to understand from from their experience is, I believe, the best gift that you can give somebody in that situation, precisely because however well intentioned, and I do believe a lot of us are well intentioned, but I also believe a lot of us are uncomfortable with not being able to do anything or say anything. But the truth of the matter is you can't. And to try to remove that factor, that emphasis, and just be with somebody, it takes your own ego out of it. And if you feel, which isn't to say that acts, helpful acts aren't a nice thing to offer somebody, but giving them that choice, uh, sometimes offering to do something for somebody, or if you know the person and have a good relationship and logistical things. I mean, there's a reason why we bring food. There's a reason, and all those things are wonderful things. Logistical things, picking up kids, meal trains, all those things. They're wonderful. Um, and they're needed. People need to go on, they have things to do. But to fully accept that there are no words and nothing you can do that's going to fix it. And you're also not going to understand their experience either. And I think we're so conditioned to try to offer words that get that we understand. And I think it's short-sighted, and I think it's kind of heartbreaking, because even people will share with me, I'm suffering because of the loss of a mother. I know that's nothing compared to what you went through. How is that useful? Your loss is still important. It's still, part of your experience. It's still painful for you. And we don't have to compare. I can hold space for what you have endured without trying to one up you or compete against that my loss is greater. I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind too, because that doesn't really serve anybody. I think we all have our own journey and our own losses that we have to address. And certainly, we might not necessarily always be in the emotional capacity to carry that for somebody. And I'm not suggesting that we do. There's importance for therapy and grief work. Um, but I think that that's one of the best things, is even to say, I don't really understand your experience. I can't really understand your experience. It can be a really powerful thing to just validate that what they're going through, whatever loss that is incredibly unique to their story and their experience. You don't have to understand it. Get over yourself. And I think even about myself, it's not always a bad place. We are seeking to make connections in our relationships from our experiences to other people's experiences. But can you hold that truth and the competing contradictory truth, like the paradox, right? That there are comparisons between, lived embodied experiences of grief and loss, and yet there are distinctions. And can we hold both of those at the same time without trying to completely homogenize everybody's experiences? That's the balance. So I understand where it comes from, and it's actually a great thing in some ways, relationship building and building connections. But can it be both and rather than either or?
We say thank you again to Danielle for sharing her story with us and being so open and honest and vulnerable. And to go beyond the show, you can always connect with us at No Stigmas on all social media platforms and at nostigmas.org. Thank you again so much for joining us today. And remember, be unsilent. We'll see you next time.